Hey, let's talk more halacha.
Great, let's do it.
All right. So last week we talked about the Melacha of Zorع, of planting, and the next Melacha in the Mishnah is Choresh, plowing. Big question is obviously, doesn't plowing usually come before planting? Why is plowing after planting suddenly?
So that's a great question, and the Gemara actually asked it. The Gemara says that the Mishnah was written in Eretz Yisrael. So for those of us who are zocheh to live here in Eretz Yisrael, so we know the ground could be a little tough sometimes. So the Mishnah explains that in Eretz Yisrael you have to plow, then plant the seeds, then you have to dig again, plow again in order to get the seeds to really sink into the ground. So Rashi explains that the Mishnah is teaching us that even that second dig, that second plow is also considered a Choresh. But for sure, plowing a field, like you described, that would definitely be a Melacha of Choresh.
So basically from the Gemara, what comes out and from the other Gemaras is that not only digging a hole in order to put a seed in after, but also any type of digging in the ground is prohibited as Choresh. The question is it any digging? Is there anything you're allowed to dig in the ground?
The Mishnah Berurah explains that really there are two things. It's anything you do to soften the ground in preparation for planting or beautify the ground in a way that would be helpful for planting. That is all Choresh. It's all to help for planting. So it comes out a couple things that will be permitted therefore. One is if you dig on land that's not fertile, like digging on a desert. Can't grow there, so the digging there is not significant because it's not going to soften it in a way that prepares it for growth. Another example of this would be based on what we talked about last time when you water the ground. As we mentioned briefly, when you water the ground, the Gemara seems to conclude it's a violation of both planting, Zorع, because you enhance growth, and softening the ground because it softens the ground in preparation for further growth. What about liquids that won't enhance growth? So that the Shulchan Aruch says that a liquid that's bad for the ground, that is permitted. You're allowed to pour it on. And therefore the Shulchan Aruch says you're allowed to go to the bathroom, you're allowed to urinate on the ground on Shabbos because it won't enhance the growth. It's not Zorع. And even though it softens the ground, it doesn't soften the ground in a way that will prepare it for further growth. The Mishnah Berurah actually questions whether this is true scientifically, but he knows that the common practice, and I guess that continues today, is to do this on Shabbos and not worry about it.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. What about digging for fun? Is there any issue with digging in the ground for fun and kids playing over there?
This brings us to one of the fundamental principles in Hilchos Shabbos called Melacha Sheina Tzricha Legufa. The Gemara in Shabbos says that if one digs a hole, but the purpose of the hole is only to use the dirt, but not to actually get the result of a hole, Rabbi Shimon holds that one is not in violation of the Melacha min HaTorah because, as Tosfos explains, you are not doing the Melacha for the purpose that it was done for in the Mishkan.
Whoa, hold on a second. Melacha Sheina Tzricha Legufa. Why do we care what the person is intending to do? What does it matter? In the end of the day, he dug a hole. There's a hole there.
That's a great question. And in fact, the Gemara Chagiga says that this distinction is analogous to a mountain being held up by a thread. You wouldn't have thought of it on your own. But the Gemara explains that this is another principle that goes back to what we talked about previously, that we learned the halachas of Shabbos from the Mishkan. The construction of the Mishkan in the Torah was described as Melachos Machsheves. And Rav Asher Weiss, the great posek today in Yerushalayim, points out that Unkelus translate Melachos Machsheves as Ividas Umnin, which means the work of an expert. That means that to be Melacha on Shabbos, it's got to be considered the work of an expert. Now, Melachos Machsheves impacts many areas of halacha, but Rav Asher Weiss explains that this is the guiding principle behind all these halachos. In this case, the explanation is that an expert craftsman always takes action with the normal and clear purpose in mind. So anything done for a different purpose would not fall under Melachos Machsheves. So here, the normal reason for the melacha of digging is to prepare the ground, to use the ground. Here, where you dig just to get dirt out and you don't care about the hole, you're not doing it in the way of an expert craftsman, and therefore will not be a violation min HaTorah. It is important to note, though, that it's still asur mid'Rabbanan, as Chazal couldn't just permit something so nuanced outright, but Melacha Sheina Tzricha Legufa will have an impact in various situations, as we'll see in the coming weeks.
Okay, so what about playing in the sand? Is there any issue with that?
Regular sand is actually muksa, which means you can't move it directly and you can't play with it. The reason for this is that anything that has no purpose on Shabbos, like sticks and stones, is considered muksa. What about a sandbox that is set aside for the purpose of children playing? It obviously has a purpose because we made it so kids could play. So the Mishnah Berurah makes an important distinction based on the Gemara between sand that immediately falls back into the hole once it's dug and wetter sand that maintains its form as a hole. So when you dig a hole that just falls in on itself, that's not considered a melacha of harisha, and that would be permitted. But if it stays, then it would be a problem. So to answer your question, you got to check the sandbox before playing in there.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. What about other implications of Choresh nowadays in our day-to-day life as adults, not only for kids?
So a very common situation is where you're outside in the backyard, you want to drag a bench, you want to drag a chair, you want to roll the stroller there. We're going to discuss that next week as there's a lot to talk about on that topic. But for a couple practical examples, the Gemara says that there are a few things that are not technically a violation of charisha, of plowing, of digging, but Chazal were worried that if we would permit these activities, a person might accidentally level the ground. And as we learned earlier, the Mishnah Berurah said, anything you do to make the ground nicer in preparation for an area that could be planted, that would be a problem. And therefore, the Gemara says you're not allowed to sweep the ground. Remember, in the old days, they had dirt floors, and on their dirt floors, if they wanted to sweep the crumbs, so that would flatten out the dirt, that would flatten out the ground. That makes it nice. Similarly, they would sprinkle water on the dirt to make it, settle down. That also makes the dirt nice. And if they would do it in a certain way, they would end up flattening the ground and be a problem of Choresh. So they said, don't even sweep, don't wet the grounds. The good news for us is at least when it comes to sweeping, that was in the times of the Gemara when people lived in dirt floors. Nowadays, that everyone has tiles on the floor, or wood on the floor, so there's no concern, and therefore you are permitted to sweep, assuming it's not a straw broom that pieces are falling out all the time. That would be a different issue of tolesh, but sweeping itself would be okay. Nevertheless, when it comes to mopping the floor, or spilling water all over the floor to clean, that the poskim are a little bit more weary of. Now, you certainly can't take a rag and mop the floor, but even to spill water or do the Israeli sponja, that would be a problem. However, there are certain scenarios where it's okay. The Shmir Shabbos Hilchos says that if some water spills, you can sponge it out because that's not cleaning the floor, you're just moving the water away. Likewise, if you have a particular spot that might be sticky or something, then it would be permitted to put water on that spot because the gezerah is only on doing the whole floor, but not when it comes to just one spot. So that would be okay. We should know, and maybe this is another topic, there's a big machlokas amongst the contemporary poskim. What about the disposable wipes? Can you put those on the floor to clean? That's another topic. We'll get back to that at a later date. One more very interesting and practical example where Chazal were worried about us doing certain activities because we might flatten out the ground, playing ball on the ground, playing soccer. Because when you play soccer, you want a flat surface. And so if you had a bump or a ditch on a weekday, you would fill that up, you would flatten out the ground so that the ball rolls smoothly when you play soccer. And therefore, the Shulchan Aruch really passes, and Mishnah Berurah explains that to play soccer on the grass on Shabbos, leaving aside other issues, whether one should play ball on Shabbos, is it Yisr Midirabanan and Gezerah, similar to sweeping the floor, because you might come to flatten out the ground, and therefore soccer should not be done at all. Shabbos only indoors, where, like we said before, we have indoor houses that have tiles, and that would be okay. So some very fascinating practical examples that come out of plowing, which you think, whoever plowed? I never plowed in my life. But here we have all these great practical examples that come out of it.
Amazing. Great. Definitely a lot over there in plowing. Nobody ever thought would be such a big issue nowadays. But last week, we left with a cliffhanger of eating at someone else's backyard. What about that?
You're right. You caught me. But like I said just before, we haven't talked about dragging your bench, sitting on chairs in the backyard. Once we understand that, then we'll be able to understand the issue of where you can eat in the backyard on Shabbos. So stay tuned. Now, again, for another cliffhanger, I promise next time we'll get to it.
Perfect. So next time, we're going to talk about that for sure. Great. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure. So many fascinating topics here. This was great.
Definitely. And we'll talk next week.
For more short and fast-paced Talking Torah clips, make sure to check out our YouTube channel.